What happens when you get fired for being kind, only to return the next day as the boss of the very people who cast you out? Some people are not born to seek attention, to stand on a stage or chase the spotlight. They choose to live quietly, to work hard, and to believe that if they treat life with kindness, life will return the favor. Julia Reyes is one of those people. A petite girl with neatly tied black hair, a gentle smile, and a voice that often sounds like a whisper. She had worked at Monroe's Diner for 3 years, a modest family diner tucked away in the eastern part of Cincinnati. Julia had no fancy degree, no one to pull strings for her, and certainly no time for daydreams. Every morning she woke up at 5, walked to the bus stop, and made a stop at the pharmacy to pick up medication for her younger brother, Mateo, who was battling an autoimmune disease. She never complained, never blamed anyone, just quietly lived and held on to the hope that somehow things would turn out okay. But life doesn't always reward good people. In the cramped kitchen of Monroe's Diner, where the scent of fryer oil and the clatter of steel pans had become a familiar rhythm, Julia gradually began to sense that something wasn't right. She noticed how the manager, Carl, favored those who knew how to nod at the right moments, like Bethany, who always got the light shifts with easy customers and never had to stay to clean up after hours. She saw Jace at the register, who never greeted anyone unless they wore a suit or an expensive watch. But Julia didn't judge. She just avoided conflict and focused on doing her job. That was until one rainy Wednesday night when everything started to change. It was a slow evening, the kind where rain pattered on the tin roof and only a few customers came in. Julia was wiping down the counter when the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air along with an older man, dark-skinned, wearing a faded button-up shirt and a weathered gray beret. He walked in slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if bracing himself for disappointment. And indeed, the moment he stopped at the door waiting to be seated, Bethany, who was leaning on the counter scrolling through her phone, didn't even look up. Jace gave him a quick glance, then turned back to his joke with a coworker. It was as if the entire diner had silently agreed that the old man wasn't worth paying attention to. Julia saw it all. She noticed how the man clutched his hat in both hands, clearly torn between walking away or giving this place a chance. It was that look that made her put down the towel, step forward, and gently say, "Good evening, sir. Just yourself tonight?" The man looked up at her, surprise flickering in his eyes before he nodded. "Yes, do you have a seat by the window?" Julia smiled and led him to a quiet corner table, the one where she often sat after her shifts. She handed him a menu, poured him a glass of water, and took his order like she would for any other customer. No more, no less. To her, serving was a form of dignity, not for tips or ratings or review tablets, but because every human being deserved to be treated with respect, no matter who they were. He ordered the grilled salmon, a dish not often chosen from the menu, and Julia headed to the kitchen without delay. When she returned with a second cup of hot coffee, he asked softly, "Are you the only one working tonight?" Julia glanced toward Bethany, who was still giggling at the counter, and replied quietly, "Usually, yes." The man chuckled under his breath and asked, "The salmon, did you choose it?" Julia nodded, and his gaze softened. "Good. Sometimes intuition doesn't lie." She didn't know why those words made her chest tighten, as if something important had just been said that she didn't fully understand. But before she could think more about it, Bethany let out a comment loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why are you fussing over that broke old man, Julia? You planning to adopt him or what?" A few snickers rose from the counter. Julia gripped the coffee tray a little tighter, said nothing, and turned back into the kitchen, leaving behind the whispers and the stares of the man who had just received a steaming cup of coffee, and in that quiet gesture, a form of gratitude deeper than any words could express. The rain from the night before had finally stopped, leaving behind a biting cold and streaks of water pooled across the early morning parking lot. Julia stepped out of her car, arms wrapped around an old canvas bag, carrying her apron and a few pieces of bread for a rushed breakfast. Her heart felt heavy, though she couldn't quite name the reason. Maybe it was the strange look in the old man's eyes as she walked away from the table last night. Or maybe it was Bethany's mocking remark that had echoed in her head the entire night. Walking into Monroe's diner, Julia expected the usual scene, the soft hum of the radio, the scent of pre-brewed coffee, and Bethany and Jace gathered at the counter as always. But something was off today. The place was unusually quiet, and the air smelled faintly of metal, thick with tension. Carl, the morning shift manager, stood at the office door, arms crossed, his gaze far from welcoming as Julia entered. "Office," he said curtly, no explanation given. Julia followed slowly, her stomach twisting into knots. Inside, the desk was more cluttered than usual, but Carl's stare was razor sharp. "Julia," he began, his tone as dry as a finance report. "After reviewing performance and evaluating the workplace environment, we've determined that certain attitudes and behaviors are not in line with the service culture of this restaurant." Julia froze. "What attitude, sir?" she asked, though deep down she already knew. Carl didn't blink. "You spend too much time with customers. Your pace disrupts workflow. And based on feedback from your coworkers, your attitude has been creating discomfort and distance." I was just doing my job," Julia replied softly, her throat tightening. "I served a customer like any other." "You broke team rhythm," Carl said flatly, pulling a thin envelope from the drawer. "We are officially terminating your contract. You may collect your final paycheck this weekend." No written warning, no thank you, not even a glance into her eyes. Julia took the envelope, stood up, and hid the humiliation of being cast out of a place she once thought of as a second home. Outside, Jace leaned against the counter chewing gum, watching her like someone who had just won a bet. Bethany smiled with smug satisfaction. "Told you, keep acting all righteous and see how long you last." Julia said nothing. She walked past them, head held high even though her eyes burned. She stepped into a morning colder than usual, but just as she reached her car, her phone vibrated. An unknown number. No name, only the words, "private caller." Julia hesitated, then brought the phone to her ear. "Julia Reyes?" A man's voice spoke, deep, calm, yet carrying an inexplicable weight. "This is Victor Langford. I believe we met last night at the corner table by the window." Julia froze, unable to say a word. "I wanted to thank you," he continued, "because you were the only one there doing the job as it should be done, not with technique, but with heart." Julia swallowed. Who are you?" There was a pause, then Victor spoke again, his voice cutting through everything around her. "I am the founder of Monroe's Diner, and last night I came back to see what I had been missing all this time. Who truly understands the meaning of a meal served with respect? And the answer is you." Cold wind swept across the windshield as Julia sat frozen in her seat, still reeling from the most unexpected phone call of her life. Inside her, fragments of memory from the night before rushed back. The way the quiet old man observed the diner, how he absorbed the atmosphere without speaking much, and the way he looked at her, not like a server, but like someone searching for something long lost. And now, that same voice, calm, yet carrying an authority that required no explanation, was inviting her to meet. "I want you to come back to Monroe's Diner," Victor Langford said, "but not as someone who serves coffee." Julia gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I just got fired, sir." "Precisely," he cut in, "because I wanted to see what happens when someone doing the right thing becomes a threat to the system. Now I have my answer." Julia swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to ask why it had to be her, why a boss would allow a decent employee to be dismissed only to intervene afterward. But the rest of her understood. He wasn't just looking for kindness. He was testing character. "I'm not sure I can manage a place like that," she said, her voice hesitant. "I've never been trained to lead." "You don't need a degree to notice when someone is forgotten in a corner booth," Victor replied. "You don't need a certificate to call a man sir when everyone else pretends he doesn't exist. I don't need a manager. I need someone who sees people." Julia was silent. Out there, the world moved on as if nothing had changed, but inside her, everything was shifting. "I have one condition," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "If I come back, I want full authority to rebuild the team. I won't be anyone's figurehead." Victor chuckled. for the first time since their conversation began. Good. A kind heart must be firm enough to defend what's right. Meet me at 7 a.m. tomorrow. The diner will reopen under your command. The call ended. Julia exhaled slowly. No one saw that moment. The moment a girl once fired for her decency stepped into a battle no one expected. But she knew this much. Starting tomorrow morning, no one would be able to ignore what was really happening inside Monroe's diner. The morning sky was clear and blue, but the atmosphere inside Monroe's diner was thick with unease. Julia stood at the entrance, fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her bag, feeling a strange sense of calm. She hadn't slept all night, not out of worry, but because her mind had begun to map out every change that needed to be made, every face, every unspoken rule, every shadow that had been hiding behind the system's polished smile. As she stepped inside, the scene could have been cut from any morning past. Bethany was sitting on the counter, glued to her phone. Jace was joking around with the delivery guy at the back door. Carl, the manager, had just stepped out of his office, arms full of paperwork, walking with that same brisk pace that never bothered to meet anyone's eyes. But the moment Carl saw Julia, he stopped in his tracks. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice cold and tight with forced composure. Julia didn't answer right away. She simply smiled, a smile that, for the first time in 3 years, didn't bow its head, then set her bag down on the counter. Bethany looked up, let out a scornful laugh. "Oh, here to beg for your job back? Guess you still haven't heard. This place doesn't keep people who are too emotional." "No," Julia said softly, her voice smooth and clear. "I'm here to start my shift, as the new manager." The room went silent. Jace nearly dropped the coffee he was holding. Carl stared at her, wide-eyed, then scoffed. "I haven't received any notice about this. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling security." "Please do," came a calm, resonant voice from the entrance. "Then I'll call security myself, to escort you off the premises." All heads turned. Victor Langford walked in, clad in a charcoal gray overcoat, his posture upright, his gaze cutting through every layer of pretense in the room. Carl went pale. Bethany froze. Victor didn't need to explain. He pulled a thin folder from his coat and placed it on the counter. Inside was an audio recording, documenting the insults Carl, Bethany, and Jace had exchanged about Julia, about customers they deemed not worth serving, and about the need to clean people like her out before they ruin the system. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "As of today, Carl, you no longer hold a position at Monroe's Diner. If you'd like to discuss legal matters, please contact my attorney." Carl opened his mouth, seemed to search for something to say, then closed it again. He gathered his things quietly and walked past everyone like a shadow exposed. No one spoke. Victor turned to the rest of the staff. "If anyone has a problem with an honest person being given the chance to lead, the door is open." No one left. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of hope. Julia stood tall, eyes steady on those who once treated her like a doormat. She wasn't there for revenge. She was stepping into a role that, by all rights, should have always existed in a culture built on decency. From now on, this diner would relearn how to serve, not just food, but dignity. On Julia's first day sitting in the manager's office, sunlight poured through the glass window, casting streaks of light across the faded, stain-marked wall. On the desk sat two things: a cup of untouched black coffee and a stack of old employee files Victor had left behind. In them, cold notes appeared line by line. Bethany prioritizes high-end customers, potential PR handler. Jace, strong communication skills, lacks internal discipline. Hal, dishwasher, 73 years old, too slow for peak hours. Julia closed the folder. It wasn't about speed. It wasn't about public relations. What she needed were people who respected customers, whether they wore tailored suits or secondhand sweaters. The first staff meeting took place right in the dining room, exactly at noon. People sat scattered, partly out of reluctance, partly because no one knew what Julia would say. She didn't take the podium. She pulled out a chair and sat among them, looking directly into their eyes. "I'm not here to be the boss," she began. "I'm here to restore what this place once had, and has since lost." She paused for a moment. There will be no more distinction between customers who look rich and those who look poor. No more shift assignments based on favoritism. And from today, anyone caught taking someone else's tips will be held accountable, publicly. No negotiations. No one clapped, but no one objected. And within that silence, the seed of change had been planted. Bethany said nothing, but her eyes were sharp like blades. Jace muttered under his breath, "Let's see how long she lasts." Julia heard it all, but she didn't react. Because she knew resistance doesn't always come in words. It comes in the quiet sabotage behind closed doors. And sure enough, it came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, the diner was oddly empty during what should have been peak hours. Julia checked the reservation system. Every online order had been canceled. A technical glitch? No. A single IP address had accessed and deleted them all within the same 30-minute window. The source? The front register. Jace. She didn't confront him in front of everyone. Instead, she printed the entire log and placed it on his desk the next morning, without writing a single word. Jace said nothing, but his expression had changed. There was no more smugness, only fear. And Bethany? She chose a more classic route, poisoning the atmosphere with whispers, with rumors, with repeated reminders to new hires that, these days, we're required to serve people with fake virtue. Julia didn't stop her. She let time speak for itself. And time chose someone to speak for her, Noah. Noah was the busboy no one really noticed, working night shifts to save money for school. One evening, as Julia was reviewing paperwork, he gently knocked on the office door. "Miss Julia, I've heard a lot of things they've been saying about you, but I just wanted to say this is the first time someone's ever asked me if I needed slip-resistant shoes." Julia looked up. Noah blushed. "I just wanted to say, if you ever need someone to stay after shift and help clean up, I can stay." That was the moment Julia realized the strongest reforms don't come from authority. They come from resonance, from gratitude, from the quietest people in the room. The next morning, Julia hung a sign right above the register. It wasn't a list of rules, just one handwritten sentence. "Kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest choice you can make." A customer stopped, read it, and smiled. An employee saw it and stayed silent. As for the battle, it was far from over. But now Julia knew. She was no longer fighting it alone. On Saturday morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of Monroe's diner, casting a soft glow over steaming cups of coffee and the relieved expressions of familiar customers. The atmosphere inside the diner no longer carried the weight it once did. Not because people were pretending to be cheerful, but because there was now a quiet sense of assurance that this place was finally being run by someone who truly cared. Julia sat at the familiar corner table beneath the wall-mounted menu board, calmly reviewing shift schedules, time-off requests, and handwritten customer complaints. Not to respond, but to remember. She still checked every cleaning cloth by hand, inspected the baking oven, and monitored the recently upgraded POS system. Once, Victor asked her, "Don't you ever get tired handling every little thing?" Julia simply smiled. "I used to be the one doing those little things, so I know how much they matter." He didn't say another word, but that same day he sent the diner a brand new industrial dishwasher. Bethany never formally resigned, but she no longer had room to manipulate others, nor anyone left to manipulate on her behalf. Mid-month, she requested a transfer to another branch. Julia didn't stop her. She just nodded and wished her good luck, not out of sarcasm, but with genuine sincerity. Jace had grown noticeably quieter. One evening, while Julia was washing her hands at the sink, he approached and handed her a small notebook. "This belonged to Hal. He forgot it the day he left. I thought, you'd be the one to keep it safe." Julia took it. It was Hal's dishwashing notebook, pages filled with shaky handwriting, small tricks for cleaning quickly, polishing without scratching glaze, how to sort hot water used to save gas. She held it tightly, as if it were a treasured heirloom. Hal had retired, not because he was no longer capable, but because Julia and Victor insisted he enjoy the rest of his life in safety and comfort. They didn't dismiss him, they offered him a new title, Honorary Advisor, the first title that made him laugh and then cry. Customers came in greater numbers each week, but strangely, the diner retained its peaceful rhythm. Maybe it was because the people serving there no longer had to act. They smiled because they meant it. One day, an elderly woman forgot her wallet, and Julia ran 3 blocks to return it. The woman cried and embraced Julia like a granddaughter. The next day, she returned with a box of homemade cookies, not as a thank you, but as a gift to share. Each week, Julia took 15 minutes for a one-on-one with every new staff member. Not to train them on procedures, but to ask a single question. Have you ever worked somewhere that made you feel like you didn't matter? Each answer was a story, and after every story, Julia took notes, so that this place would never become part of anyone's story like that. One early autumn afternoon, Victor Langford returned. He sat at the corner table without revealing who he was, and ordered grilled salmon and black coffee, just like the first time. When Julia brought the food, he smiled. Tastes the same as that day? Today's salmon was cooked in the new oven, Julia replied. But the secret is still in the hands of the one who chose the dish. He placed an envelope on the table. The company's opening a new location in Denver. I'd like you to train the managers there. Julia looked at the envelope, then at him. I'll go, she said. But this Monroe's Diner, I'll always come back. Because this place taught me that sometimes doing the right thing is the only way not to lose yourself. That night, Julia stood by the window looking out onto the street. Outside, cars passed, people hurried. But inside, warm golden lights glowed. The clink of spoons and glasses echoed gently, and the laughter of the staff rang out, soft, honest. At the register, a small wooden-framed sign stood on display, with a handwritten note that read, "Here, kindness is not a rule, it's a tradition." And sometimes, that's enough to change an entire little world. As this story comes to an end, one truth becomes clear. Kindness may come at a cost, but it is never wasted. In today's working environment, dignity and justice cannot rely solely on systems. They must be protected by individuals brave enough to stand up, like Julia. If you believe that even a small act can spark a big change, hit like and subscribe to help spread these positive values. And don't forget to leave a comment with the phrase "choose kindness," because that might just be the beginning of a quiet revolution with the power to transform everything.